I thought that was fantastic, and I found myself thinking about the concepts of universal housing, and I wonder whether you've looked at synergies between universal housing. I mean, the concept of, say, ageing in place, and I can remember seeing an example of a fab house where the people in it had quite a severely disabled son, and the bathroom was just beautifully designed so that they could easily get in and out to wash him and that sort of thing. But the point was made that it would also be a fab bathroom for children and a fab bathroom for older people as well. And I'm wondering about, talking about the specifics, whether that's something that that you've looked at as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's not something that I've got particular experience in, but I think that it's those crossovers between, because universal design is often, it's a design for a present state that people are in, and then it's also, I guess, anticipating potential losses of mobility and different things down the line. So it needs to work now and in the future. And so that kind of dual design, in a way, like designing for more than just what we have now, has a lot of potential.
The other thing I thought was, when I was looking at it, is I was struck by the sort of funky suburbanness of some of the decisions that people have made, like using the garage in that way that so many families just repurpose houses and knock them around until they get them happening. And it was interesting to see in a new house that had been designed with an architect that they were on task.
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to your comment before about suburbia being the studio, because I think, there is just, it's a wonderfully flexible place for all its problems and all its issues. It has been the place where people have been able to make their own place and make the kind of housing that they want, because you take an old fibro place out at Wentworthville and you can just do whatever you want with it.
Thanks, Hugo. I really enjoyed that, and I'm just like Ryan, I'm always amazed at what designers can do. I wouldn't have a hope of being able to do that. But anyway, I really want to build on something Marla said, and I'll just set it in context. I mentioned in my talk that a few years ago I was involved in a big study about international students in the city of Melbourne, and it happens that, and housing, and I was working with architects and urban designers and so on, and it happens that in the city of Melbourne it is now the case that almost 50% of the population is students, because we have the University of Melbourne and RMIT right in the middle of it. So it's a huge population of that central municipality. So I went along to the urban designers at the City of Melbourne and I said, well, all right, we've got all these new temporary migrants, as we were saying earlier, young people. They're the city now, they're half the city. So what does that mean for the sort of housing we should have for them, the way we should be thinking about public space and repurposing some of it? And they just said to me, oh well, good design is the same for everybody. I mean, if it's good design, it will work for everybody equally. And I was very dissatisfied with that, because that sort of implies the notion that the everybody is the stranger or the kind of uniform member of the public that doesn't have to be differentiated. Anyway, so I just say that I've always worried about that and not really known how to respond to it. So what really impressed me about what you were saying was that in that one, was it the German house for Germans? I don't know why Germans were so special, but it was, picky. It was possible. The house wasn't able to be made more flexible for everybody, but there were specific sorts of person around which it was designed. And so I just wondered, are there certain figures in the public, or those of us who are being exposed to good design, are there certain ones of us who's, and it's same with your comment, Marla, about the people with the disabled child who needed a wide bathroom door and so on. So that kind of, sorry I'm taking so long to say this, that sort of person could, a provision for that bathroom would equally serve all sorts of other groups. So I just wanted to ask, are there some kinds of person that you envisage in your practice who, if you design for them, their needs can be reflected in the needs of certain other groups, which is a separate thing from saying that we're all the same as each other and that good design serves everybody equally. Sorry it took me so long to get to that. But.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a really interesting question, and it brings up the whole, I guess, one of the interactions with between architects and planners that has impact on this whole area is the one of standards, and the whole idea that's kind of come through architectural discourse from the 1930s of a kind of a universalized, idealized person who had certain measurements and, you know, could reach things in the kitchen in a certain way. And although we've departed from that in some ways, there's like, for example, the CEP 65, which regulates exactly, you know, what you can do in an apartment and minimum sizes and things like that. And so I guess it calls that into question somehow, and whether there are other ways that we can do it without creating a situation where we're just creating new slums or terrible housing conditions. In terms of finding, I guess, the new types or some, like, it's quite difficult, and that's what I find so engaging and enlivening about bringing participation into design, because then you always have fresh perspectives and different people coming in. But at some point, of course, you have to take some of those lessons and then expand it out to a new set of people. And for example, Carpet Behind was designed with the participation of a certain set of families, but it's a housing cooperative and new members come in and new families come in, and so it's kind of learning the lessons from the immediate diversity, but then you'll learn new lessons once the next people move in and readapt what we've done for their own purposes.
Fascinating. Thank you.
There's more to say on that whole relationship about effective practice and participation. I know you had a question from the beginning of the day to do with participation. Do you want to draw that in? Can you remember it? It's only 9 hours later.
It came up in the discussion about tradition and how new forms and cultural assumptions emerge, and I was thinking at that stage in the day that surely the answer there is participatory engagement and design processes where new things are created, because your perception of tradition is always what you've inherited. If there's a natural default to resist change by knee-jerking back to what your assumption about what a traditional norm is, then you're less likely to do that and create a new future tradition through the participatory process. Yes, it does relate to this discussion, I think. I'm not sure it's a question, but...
Hugo, I was interested to hear you talk a little bit more about your case study. Those were 6 Filipino families?
So 5 Filipino families and 1 Vietnamese family.
Okay, and it was, so the expectation would be that over time that makeup of cultural groups would shift and change, but they would be an understanding that what they were moving into had evolved out of a common understanding of how these spaces are used, or how families from those cultures cook and eat and...
Yeah, so there's, to explain a little bit more about the cooperative, they were originally a group of Filipino teachers, an association, and they had a housing problem, so went to the then Department of Housing and made this arrangement. But where it would go in the future, they are opening it up much more broadly, and particularly in that part of Sydney, in Canley Vale. It's a very Vietnamese area, and so they're starting to kind of invite and build their Vietnamese base as well. And so, yeah, I guess at the base of it, it's still very kind of standard Australian housing, just through the way that it was built, but we were able to start to make those little shifts, and so it's one step in the in the right direction, I guess, but there are many more steps to come.
Yeah, I was curious about the logistics of the organization too. Did they buy the land? Are they renting the land? Will there be other pieces of land they're looking for to model this elsewhere? Is this a new model of infill development that is relevant to those older sort of middle ring suburbs?
I really hope so. It was a slightly different, difficult process in their purchasing of the land. Basically, it was the situation that Cabot Bryan and Van Lang, two very successful housing cooperatives, had managed to amass these huge rental surpluses, which they wanted to purchase land and then move out of the public housing system and become independent. But at that point, Housing New South Wales kind of decided that that was really their money and their asset, and that needed to stay within the cooperative sector. So they restructured it so that there's one entity that owns all of the co-ops. And so it de-incentivized it a little bit from what the situation originally was. Yeah.
Hugo, I very, very much appreciate your talk. Like yourself, even though I am mainly an academic, I have a professional practice, and much of my professional practice has dealt with specifically issues of housing. My current project is a book called Architecture's Poverty, with an apostrophe S. Housing and the inability of architects to deal with housing, and particularly to deal with diversity in housing, is a major component of that work. So I'm going to throw out a statement which at least is partly the conclusion that I'm heading towards in this very specific chapter in the book. That architects are damned if they do and doomed if they don't. Particularly with regard to housing. And I say that because I think that the architecture profession as a profession is certainly not able to, not capable of managing diversity, because it's something that is almost beyond its capacity as a profession. Why do I say that? Because I think the term diversity within architectural parlance is one that is fundamentally about form. As in, to what extent can we have formal responses to very specific forms of cultural behavior, or social structures, or family needs, so on and so forth. And I think that at the end of the day, whether one takes the attitude of providing a shell or providing very specific responses to individual needs, and that's why I make that statement, damned if they do and doomed if they don't, something will still be left out. So for example, if I look at some of the larger issues of diversity, I spent a couple of months in Singapore as part of my sabbatical this year. And I spent quite a lot of time interviewing people. As you probably know, Singapore has one of the most successful public housing projects in the entire world. Something like 90% of all Singaporeans live in public housing, and 80% of those own their public housing, which is a very interesting quirk. They are allowed to buy, they are allowed in fact to upgrade. So they move from 2 bedrooms to 3 bedrooms, they move down from 3 bedrooms to 2 bedrooms. Singapore is also a very diverse society, as in it has predominantly Chinese Singaporeans, but it has a substantial minority of Indian Singaporeans and Malaysian Singaporeans. The government mandated a long time ago, as part of their desire to achieve diversity, which is something that is not exactly a design solution, but that's what ended up happening as they built these 40 and 50-story high-rises, that the percentage of the different ethnicities has to be represented in every single housing block. Every single housing block. Now that people own their homes, and under a neoliberal administration, the Singaporean government boldly, and that's part of the reason that they have a very successful public housing program, they allow people to sell their units. So you can sell your public housing after you've lived in it for a number of years, except that you can only sell it to someone of your same ethnicity. And that's deliberate. Why? So that they can actually maintain the same kind of ethnic structure, if you will, within every block. Now, one of the things that this has actually done, which is an architectural intervention, and I've seen it in some of their projects, which is fascinating, is the fact that you end up having that. So in a sense, you have a high-rise that is 30 stories. people who happen to be of Malay origin have certain activities, they demanded space that the architects of the Public Housing Authority had to respond to. So even though there is this diversity that is accommodated within the block, there is what you actually talked about, which I think is beautiful, the specificity of accommodating communities, diverse communities, if you will, within this larger diversity. So there's a Malay space or a Chinese space or an Indian space within the blocks as well. So I don't know if you would agree with me that in a sense, architects' hands are completely tied. We are not the ones who should be entrusted with trying to achieve diversity, because we can't. That's it. That in a sense, I mean, in my own professional practice, and that's why I admire what you do, I have surrendered. I've decided that I can only engage in these discussions literally as part of an academic discourse, and where I can actually make a difference. But as a professional, as someone who in the late 70s, I designed sites and service projects. In the early 80s, I designed core housing projects. And each of these was based on the idea that you give something to people, people will do something with it. And I've seen many of my sites and service projects and many of my core housing projects completely fail. And out of no fault of my own. That in a sense, regardless of how much I worked to address the diverse needs of this community, ethnically, religiously, or what have you, ultimately there is a limit to what I can achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Nizar. I think that brings in the really interesting point that basically it's a very mercenary business, architecture. Like we work for the powers that be, and so the ones with the money, the ones with the political power are the ones who really set the agenda, and we're kind of working in this little gap in between. And so, I mean, I'm still optimistic, yes, I guess, I can see. that there is something, that there are things that we can do, even within that small space. But I think that we do need to be really realistic about what is possible within architecture. Because I think, some of the old discourses about participatory architecture were kind of, the architect is that kind of a tyrant who needs to give over his power to the people and then everything will be better. But the reality is that we don't have the power in the first place. The people who are giving us the money, they're the ones with the power. And so whether you can truly empower people through a participatory process, I don't really believe, but I think we can make things a little bit better. A little bit, maybe it's just we're designing more comfortable chairs.
David, before I give it to another architect, I want to invite the landscape architects in and see how you feel about this challenge and whether you guys feel a level of surrender is required in order to meet these challenges, how it fits in your professional practice. Fiona, you can feel me sidling up to you. Yeah. Sorry. But how have some of the points been raised today that, how do they sit on you as a landscape architect? How do they resonate?
Thanks for that. I think landscape architects are luckier than architects because we're dealing with built form as essentially development of spaces rather than perhaps form, I'm not sure. The approach we take in our practice is to actually look for the chinks in the brief that we're given and to go hell for leather for those, what we're calling them, the light that shines between the cracks. We interrogate that light shining through the cracks like you wouldn't believe, and we drive our clients' briefs much further than they ever expected. We do that both with participatory design forms. So if we get a brief that says we would like a diverse landscape for, say, all abilities, we will usually say we need to go out and talk to people about that. And that was never in the brief in the first place, but we actually push and get it into the brief wherever we can and actually find that what I call going in sideways. So we weren't getting the directive to go into participatory design from above. It wasn't coming from the community below. We are, as designers, saying we believe in this process and we think it's important and we go for it. I've learned to do that by politically making it useful to the client, and therefore it serves the public really well too. So if you say that the mayor is going to look good when they stand up and say that they spoke to their constituent users, I found to get participatory design straight through. So I'm being quite naughty, really, but we get there, and then we've got the public on board and into a participatory design process. So that's one little chink we always go for, long after we win the job, not before we win the job, otherwise we lose the job. So I've learnt that technique. The other technique is, okay, quite often we're asked to design an all-abilities space, and our practice is we specialise in the design for children. So when we started off this form of design before, where we were designing specifically spaces for children with different levels of ability to play, I've now learned to drive that equation to, I'm not even sure we're designing playgrounds anymore, we're designing spaces for people, and we design for everyone in that equation. Now in play we can do that because play brings out, now somebody was saying this before, activity in the moment. So if we're looking for as a society, where do we come together to have activities in the moment, there's nothing quite like play to bring it about. And so we're dressing up play as the cue by which all of our different members of society can come together and do something as we all accept is a human experience. So we're finding a lot more goes on in a playground rather than just playing, where there's a lot of eating, and there's a lot of conversation, and there's a lot of socialising, and it's not uncommon now for there to be many more adults in our playgrounds than children, and there are never enough seats. No matter how many seats we put in, they're never enough. So we're designing convivial social spaces, and cue is the play by which everyone's coming together in their diverse needs and interests, and quite often we're finding that that's suiting our very diverse societies. But there's no mention of it. It's a seamlessness, and people are not always sure how they came to be enjoying themselves in that space. Usually the comment is, when I'm there are never enough seats, and we put in so many seats and there's still not enough seats because, as I was saying to Ruth, if you're holding a baby and that baby drops its dummy and somebody else walking past picks up that baby's dummy and hands it to you, you've started a conversation, and the baby has legitimised that, or perhaps swinging somebody in a swing. These are really fantastic spaces, and we can really push these concepts of diversity, and we can really push the idea that we're all in it together in this mad up, mixed up thing called life within a city landscape. So that's how, as landscape architects, we're pushing this at the practice level. But we don't necessarily say to our clients, we're designing more than a playground. We just quietly get on with it.
Yeah.
That's one of the things you can do. But it's perhaps a peculiarity of landscape architecture. It's a very flexible form of design. Your idea about what a park and a playground might be may be very different to mine, and there's no right or wrong. But maybe a house is different. I don't know. Just a question. Anyway.
Can you pass your mic to Lynn?
Well, I was just going to add too that for the most part our projects are in the public domain, which is quite different than imagining the private habitation of a family or an individual. And so I think that's also where we rely on environment behavior studies research, and we have generalized ideas about how people use space and people's response to certain kinds of stimuli and so forth. But we also look for the things that we learn that work for many different people. And I was thinking, the analogy in the public domain to the bathroom that suits many different users is when we started doing curb cuts, and originally it was for people with disabilities, but then we soon discovered that people who were pushing prams also benefited from having curb cuts. And so I think, again, from a purely public works sort of mentality, the more you can double up the benefits, the advantages of diversity, then you can win as well. And it's like Fiona was talking about, play environments become much more than just a place for kids to play in. So and that's where I think we, our remit is broad, And we're dealing with, broad understandings of people gathering in public places and how to facilitate that. It's great. And we're also dealing with nature.
Yeah.
Which is the other added bonus.
That's now called the non-human
The non-human other.
Yeah, I think that's potentially where the crossover is. Like you're still designing for a bunch of specific things, but in a space that's got to be used by so many different people at so many different times. So I think that's what's analogous. And I love your sneaky way of working.
I've got a bunch of interesting reflections and perspectives coming amongst the people who are going to formally respond to the day in the next half an hour, but I've left off one. And Emma, I'm zeroing in on you, and that is the perspective of local government.
Look, I'm thrilled that there are so many capable designers out there that are looking for those cracks in the brief and what have you. I mean, my role as a strategic planner is just to create the space. I work at North Sydney Council. We look at where we can sort of increase the height controls, and we try to capture some of that value uplift and put it back to create the space in the public domain. And we might just simply do the setbacks. We're going to negotiate with the developers to get setbacks along the streets. We capture some of that value and buy land for public space. We negotiate with the developers to get space within the buildings for public purposes. And we don't write briefs very well. We don't know exactly what we need to do. We might write one brief every year or what have you. You guys are responding to multiple briefs. So we don't do it necessarily very well, so we rely on practitioners, designers to come in there and tell us what we need and use that experience and really sort of, use your experience and tell us what we need. We just simply create that space for you guys to come in and do something really, really well and bring in that sort of understanding about diversity. I just create the space. That's all I do. I do create density, as you were talking about before. I'm the one that is getting a lot more population into North Sydney and to St Leonards. I've got that density, but I've only got that one little sort of opportunity to create some space, and you guys need to just dive right in and make that space work as best as you humanly possibly can. So more power to you.